This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for this program is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, most of you know Eric Barnes is the host of WKNO's weekly public affairs program, Behind the Headlines, and in the interest of full disclosure, I produce that show, and it's been great getting to know Eric over the years and his capacity as host of the show. Well, this time we're going to switch chairs, and he's going to be in the hot seat because our friend Eric is a published author. His new book is called Something Pretty, Something Beautiful, a book that has been described by one critic as elegantly constructed and lovingly, tenderly, and savagely written. Nice to have you on the show, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. It is, of course, strange to be here.
I know.
I don't have a tie on. I don't even know what to do.
Yeah,
I don't know what to do.
But here's some things. You know, I was thinking about it. I was thinking about, gosh, that's going to be strange sitting at a table with Eric, but there's so much that I really don't know about you. You have this whole life as an author, and when I was reading the book, one of the things that I admired about it was the way that you played with tension, you know, in the book itself. But before we get into that, let's first talk about what the story of the book is. Give us an idea. Sure.
It's a story of 5 kids growing up in Tacoma, Washington, in a very rough blue-collar town, fairly aimless life, and it tracks their lives together, doing increasingly dangerous and destructive things. The narrator, Brian Porter, also has a relationship with a more positive relationship with another friend that's very separate. And then the book moves through time. It's told largely out of order. There's scenes where he's looking back as an adult on the things he'd done. And to some degree, you know, somebody had said to me, it reads like a memoir. It's not a memoir. It is a work of fiction, and whoever reads it is going to want to know that. But it just follows their self-destructive path.
Why did you choose that narrative trick? I mean, you have like what is it? Present and Tacoma and driving back.
There are 5 parts that recur through each of the 5 parts. I wrote it. I tend to write out of order, which is a very strange thing, and I write very much out of order, and I piece it back into order. This one I decided, well, let's just leave it out of order, and actually there's a way in which, because they've done such bad things, the narrator is to some degree confessing, and he's to some degree coming to terms with himself and admitting what he'd done. And I thought it was interesting that, you know, he would present in the opening that maybe some bad things had happened, but mostly it was sort of just nonsense, and it was not necessarily destructive to others. And then it gets obviously, you know, more destructive to others. But when you look back at the book, and I've told people this, one of the most violent scenes in the end actually happens chronologically very early. But early in the book, Porter couldn't admit how bad they were. And so I liked that idea, this notion that it's building towards something really bad.
Sure, because you'll be 3 chapters later and you'll go, oh my gosh, that piece just fell into place.
Right.
And it's a great storytelling technique.
Yeah.
It really keeps you on your toes as you're reading this.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad. And I like books that are written in strange, you know, narrative perspectives that move around. I don't write like, you know, Vladimir Nabokov at all, but I like that he plays and he has untrustworthy narrators. And, you know, Kurt Vonnegut loves to shift time and tense and place. And those are writers that I really always enjoy.
Exactly. And the first time I ever saw it in movies was when Quentin Tarantino did it with Pulp Fiction.
Yeah.
You know, where he seemed to take, I always imagined that when he wrote that script, he wrote it completely in a linear way, and then took and just started taking strips and then put it on clothespins on a line. You know,
the ending scene of Pulp Fiction, which is so great. I've seen him interviewed about it, and it's the scene with Samuel L. Jackson and just the incredible, you know, I'm the shepherd, he has the gun. That's one of the first scenes they filmed. and they didn't know how the movie would end, and they finished filming that scene, and Quentin Tarantino looked to his producer, writer, and said, well, we just found the ending. And so, and I kind of write a little bit that way. I mean, just because I sort of want to write scenes and then string them together.
The haunting part about it, and this plays into the whole thing that I mentioned about tension at the very beginning. The interesting part about this is that this is a group of friends who live in Tacoma, Washington, and there's kind of this perfect storm of boredom, the desire to have more and more adrenaline in their lives, to the point that they keep pushing it and pushing it.
Right.
And you keep thinking to yourself, it gets more and more exciting along those lines, and you keep thinking to yourself, something really terrible is about to happen here.
Yeah.
But you're never quite sure, and that tension just builds. And there are times when you really do have to say, okay, let's let's relax here, because something's going to go wrong here. Something's going to go haywire.
Yeah. It's, you know, and I wrote it a long time ago in a somewhat different form. And then I came back to it. And when I came back to it, even I thought, this is so relentlessly dark. And it was a strange experience to read it probably 5 years after I'd written the original scenes, and again, in a slightly different form. It's dark even for me, and it's relentless even for me. And yeah, I joked with my wife, we were talking about the book recently, and I said, you know, there are only 4 jokes in the whole book. I've told more jokes on the show, you know, I mean, on a you know, serious local TV news show, you know, but yet for some reason that Tacoma and that environment I wanted to create for them was this, there is nothing good except the adrenaline, as you were saying, they can create. They really have no family. They really have no, you know, I think there's even maybe an explicit line, there's no religion. A number of reviews have talked about how they're motherless. They're not even just without family, they don't have mothers. And so all they have is each other, and like you said, the adrenaline and tension they can build.
But you know, in reading it, you begin. Everybody's got something in their childhood where they, or you know, in their teens when they did something stupid. Before we started rolling on the show here, I was talking about growing up in Florida, and we used to drive these Thunderbirds down these roads as quick as we could, and then. Years later, it just made us cringe to think about this.
Oh yeah,
you know?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I've said to people, I mean, I still have family and friends, and I grew up in Tacoma, and some of them were, you know, you're going to really beat up on Tacoma, and I said, you know, this isn't the real Tacoma. I mean, there are all kinds of things about it that are, I guess, factually accurate. It rains a lot there. It's near the mountains and so on. But it's really this imagined Tacoma that I've created. It's a dark place, and it could be, you know, it could be Florida, it could be Memphis, it could be the outskirts of Paris, and it doesn't matter. It's anyone's dark place. It's anyone's, you know, dark memories. Again, exaggerated and built up, you know, fictionally, but it could be anywhere.
Well, the book has been getting just great reviews.
Thanks.
And,
yeah, it's been really nice.
And you're going to leave us for just a couple of weeks to go on a tour out there in San Francisco and the Pacific Northwest.
Right. Yes.
I envy you for that. It's going to be interesting to. It's going to be interesting to see the reaction out there to the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, one of your previous books that you wrote, and this was a couple of years ago. This is when I first realized that you had published works. Was a book called Shimmer, and again, this is a kind of a tension that people. You know, that people recognize even in their own workplace in the character of Shimmer.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So Shimmer is a book, came out in 2009, a novel about a person who has built a company that's built on a lie, and it becomes this big kind of .com sort of high-tech company that's growing and growing and growing. And I'm not giving anything away because I think it's page 5 that he admits to the reader that it's all built on a lie. His wealth, everything he's done. And there's some elements of darkness, and you know, I don't know why I you know, continually introduce those things into the books and stories I write, but it's a lighter book. It's sort of funny. It's about the office, politics in the office. There's moments of lightness, and actually in that book I meant to set out. I don't know what this says about me in my writing, but I meant to write a fairly light book, almost silly kind of book about office life, and it just started taking this darkness, and I suddenly wrote into it that there was a lie, and it was all built on a lie. And there's a kind of, I don't know, a character who leads the narrator down that road. And as with, you know, Something Pretty, Something Beautiful, there's kind of this tension between how much is the narrator responsible for what he's done and how much has he been led. And ultimately, you know, he's fully responsible for his own actions, but both of those narrators struggle with that. They kind of try to find, well, in the current book, you know, Will Wilson led me to do this, and in the other book, it's Trevor, the main character's brother or cousin, who's kind of led him to do it. And the book is about realizing that no, he did it himself. He created this and disappointed and hurt people. In Shimmer, it's hurting them, you know, personally and financially and so on. And obviously, in Something Pretty, it's more physical.
Yeah, and at the core of it, there's always that sense that the characters have that there's an invincibility about them.
Yes, right.
Which,
that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That's totally true of both environments. One, this barren, blue-collar, physical, very non-intellectual, uneducated life, but there's that invincibility. And you're right, that I hadn't thought about that at all, that Shimmer, they are all riding this invincibility that begins to crumble. And you know, in Shimmer too, I shift these points of view. They're little in between chapters that are from the third person, from other characters in the book, and to the main character, to the narrator, they're these perfect people who work for him. They're his friends. He loves them. He knows secretly he's letting them down. And then there are these quick third person scenes where you realize they're all coming unglued. One is getting divorced. One can't even eat. He's so sick. And so that invincibility and how that breaks apart is, I never thought about that connection.
You know, before the show, we were talking about the varying ways in which we see the areas that we grew up. I grew up in Central Florida, you know, Disney World, the beaches and everything, and vacationers go down there, they see one thing. Having grown up there, I see something completely different. Now, I've never been to the Pacific Northwest.
Right.
And everybody tells me, you've got to go.
Right.
You've got to explore every part of it. You know, it's just a wonderous place. But you see something different out there.
Yeah, I do. And, you know,
what was it like growing up in Tacoma?
It was not as bad as what's in the book, but I grew up in a very blue-collar setting. You know, there were 10, my dad went to college, but of the other, you know, 12 aunts and uncles on both sides of the family, no one else ever did. There were, you know, quite honestly, a lot of alcoholics and alcoholism among my aunts and uncles and among my cousins. And my uncle, who I spent a great deal of time with, was a welder and was a car fanatic, which partly, in some ways, played into the presence of the cars in the book.
Yeah.
And it was just a big blue-collar town, big public schools, very, you know, sort of. We went 10 minutes without talking about schools, but a dark place for me and my brother, and we wanted to get out very much. And the book is very much about that. Part of the book is true, that the narrator is very much trying to find a way out, and he can't see a way. Now, I was lucky in that I got out through education. I mean, I got out through being better than average in school, and then seeing that, wait, I could go to college, and had at least some models of people who had gone to college and so on. But it was more than going to college. The whole thing was to get out. And that was consuming for me for probably when I was 10, 11, 12 and older. I mean, I went to school in Connecticut, and I joke with people and they think I'm crazy, but it was physically the farthest away I could get. And why'd you pick that place? Because physically on a map, it was really far away. And some of that's nonsense, you know, some of that's unfair and is, you know, adolescent sort of angst. I mean, I'm 45 years old now, and I don't know that I carry all that. But at the time, you know, when I was 18, 19, 20, and even until I was probably 30, and I wrote a lot of the original parts of this back when I was in my 20s. I mean, the core stories among these four in a different structure. I still had all those memories of very, you know, rough people in my schools and rough people in the neighborhood, rough cousins of mine who were scary individuals.
But I think getting away is important. I do, because you know, when I finally ended up leaving, I went to New York City, and it was culture shock for me because I lived in essence a small town. Yeah. But it widened everything that you know,
Yeah.
everything that came next was just a lesson in life and a lesson in
Yeah.
dealing with different situations. You also took on some varied jobs.
Yeah. Yes, I did.
Some
in
jobs
preparation for my life as a publisher and talk show host.
That's
It was mandatory that I drive a forklift and that I drive a truck in Alaska, and yeah.
You were on a fishing boat.
I was I was actually in a fish processing plant.
Oh,
on
I
the
see,
on
I
the I've been out, I had lots of friends who were fishermen, and so I've been out on commercial fishing boats and so on. But no, I worked in a big fish processing plant a couple of summers in the Kenai Peninsula, a couple hours outside Anchorage. Lived in a tent and worked, you know, day and night and made money. That was when I was making money for college.
Now, see, this is scary to me, and I'll tell you why. The thing about it is, my dad worked a lot of blue collar jobs before he, you know, ended up on, you know, in his career, and he always told me he had a sense about me, and he said, son. He said, "Don't ever get near a construction site, or they'll knock you upside the head with a 2x4." You know, and to hear that from your father has an effect on you.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know? But the thing is that the people that my father knew and people that my father worked around, and the people in our family were blue collar, and they just had uncommon good sense. And it was amazing to see how they could work through various things. I mean, some of the smartest people that I've ever met were
Sure.
blue collar people.
Yeah.
But how did you survive? How did you survive in that?
I mean, at the time, that felt more as normal as anything, I suppose. I mean, you know, because I had worked. I mean, living in a tent and all that was a little strange, but I had worked. My parents had started. My mom and stepfather started a construction company, and so I had worked, you know, kind of after school and summer jobs in Tacoma and all through the Northwest, and out installing and building and taking apart docks and floats. And so I'd been around blue collar folks and construction sites and all that from, I don't know, when I was 14 or 15 on.
Yeah, but as an author, it gave you a nice
Yeah,
wide experience.
Yeah. But you know what's
to draw
interesting?
from, too.
Sure, but I didn't know you could write about that stuff because I was a big reader, but I wasn't exposed to a lot of books and modern fiction. It was kind of ad hoc what I read as a kid and as a teenager, and so it wasn't until I was in college and I read Raymond Carver. His stories, you know, what we talk about when we talk about love and Cathedral, and then Richard Ford, who only has a couple collections of short stories out, one called Rock Springs, and they're all about people in the Northwest. And I read those books and I thought, oh, those are the people I grew up with. They sit around and drink at kitchen tables, they work jobs, they're semi-transient. And I thought, and it was magical to read that, and it's frightening. And that was when I realized, I mean, I'd worked for school papers and kind of that. There was sort of a journalism thing going on, but I didn't really understand what I could write about because in my mind, I didn't have anything to write about because I'd never read anything about the kind of life I had led, and that was eye-opening. I remember sending one of those books to my brother, who this book is dedicated to, in part because we grew up through this Tacoma thing and escaped this Tacoma thing together. And I remember sending him a Raymond Carver book of stories, and he called me and just said, I can't believe that. I can't believe somebody wrote about all that. That's exactly what we grew up with. And so, you know, then over time I've written different kinds of stories, and Shimmer is, you know, totally not in that blue collar vein, but other stuff does come out of that. And there are great people, like as anywhere, there are great people like you're articulating in the blue collar world, and the very rough people. And then the same thing, and the thing that drives me nuts, I think, having come from the blue collar world, is people who feel like a more educated, you know, white collar sort of world is somehow superior.
The pretense.
Yeah. I mean, some of the most racist people I've ever known were in Manhattan executives. I mean, they were horrible people, but they had all the world at their disposal, you know, and so I've always, people are people regardless of their circumstances.
Well, I'm going to take a hard turn. We know you to be the publisher of the Memphis Daily News.
Yeah.
And we're looking at a really revolutionary time in the newspaper industry, I think in all media, because right now I've had friends of mine say, I don't know what we're going to be in 25 years, you know, and this is a hard question that you have to ask yourself on a daily basis, working in a newspaper. what are the challenges that you see coming up? What do you think is going to happen in the future?
Oh, I mean, I think, I think the biggest challenges are on, I mean, you said hard turn, you're not kidding. The biggest challenges are on the revenue side and making money off newspapers going forward. Content-wise, I think newspapers are as strong as they've ever been, and people think, well, what do you mean? I mean, the Commercial Appeal, the USA Today, all these papers are so much smaller than they used to be. But really, if you look, the written word still drives the internet. I mean, it drives blogs. If you look at blogs about sports or politics, most of what those people are blogging about is a response to a newspaper article. And the healthcare reform, for instance, on national, huge sea changes. The newspapers, Time Magazine, written journalism has done so much to explore that, and then give fodder to all these talking heads on television, of which I guess I'm one sometimes, and of bloggers and of all these other new media people. If you look at it, so often they are responding to core journalistic work that's been done in print. It just happens to be electronic print. What people haven't really figured out, and I can't claim that the Daily News has particularly figured out, although we're doing well, is how you make money off that. Because newspapers for so long, but I don't know that everyone really understands that the bread and butter of newspapers forever were real estate listings, classified ads, and big department store advertising. Well, over the last 10 years, it's not just the internet came along, it's that all the real estate listings went to the internet, all the classifieds went to the internet, and department stores were usurped by the Walmarts and Targets of the world. So Macy's and Goldsmiths and all that, they totally had to change their model, and all that advertising money was drained out of newspapers. The other big one is cars, which is coming back, and so on. So it wasn't just the technology that print was dead or print was too expensive. It was also the advertising base the core advertising base of newspapers really all but disappeared. And it's really hard to replace that. And it's very expensive to put out, to hire good journalists. And journalists on average don't make enough money, but it's expensive to hire them and expensive to put out that good content. And it's not clear exactly how newspapers are going to make money off that good content they're putting out. But I think that the value of what's being written is as good as it's ever been.
Yeah, it's true. And one of the things is you saw huge publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post struggling with that for years, what they were going to do. You've decided at the Memphis Daily News to keep everything open. To not put a paywall up.
Right.
And things like that, but that gives you but that must bring a lot of eyeballs to your
so
to your
it's
site.
an equation. It's a formula. We can make more money. We've figured out how to sell digital advertising over the last few years. It took a while to be able to do that, especially on a local level, and get local advertisers to understand what it means to advertise online. So we do well with email advertising and website advertising and so on. But that's in part because we're free online and we draw readers. I totally get, the Wall Street Journal, for instance, has had a partial paywall since it went online, and I've subscribed to it ever since then. And I do think when you talk about paywalls, and I'll try to do this quickly, I think newspapers as an industry screwed up bad. When there was some consultant back in the late 90s who said, I can't remember who it is, who said information must be free. And got in the ears of all these this is my opinion, got in the ears of all these newspaper publishers, and they all said, oh, it's got to be free, because these really important, highfalutin consultants told us that. They made all that content free, the vast majority of them, and they got everybody addicted on that free content. Now there's a huge wave of paywalls coming up. Newspapers everywhere, from the biggest to the smallest, are putting paywalls on. They're sometimes partial paywalls, or sometimes total paywalls, and it's going to be hard to take it away. It's 10 years of free candy that everyone's had, being able to read the New York Times and the Commercial Appeal and the Daily News for free. But I think eventually you're going to have paywalls up on a lot of these sites, because why wouldn't you pay for it? You paid for it, you and I paid for the New York Times or the Commercial Appeal or whatever newspaper we're buying for decades, So.
Well, social media. You know, that's another one that everyone's trying to figure out at this point. I mean, and you can see that we're right on the cutting edge right now, where it's in its infancy. It's started revolutions. It can take a brand that's nothing and turn it into something that has amazing value in the space of, I don't know, 8 hours.
Yeah, right.
The challenges of that, it's being written on the fly. This has got to be pretty scary in a way.
I think there's a scary part to it. I think again though that you look at so much of what gets tweeted and what gets posted on Facebook. A lot of times it's responses to or reactions to written journalistic articles, and so I think still there's a great role where the printed word has a critical role in taking a complicated issue and breaking it down and getting all the sides in and so on, and then let people post and tweet and call you an idiot for saying what you said and so on and so forth. The other interesting thing though is where people are, they're in Tahrir Square in Egypt and they're reporting the news that way, and you see more and more journalists finding ways to incorporate tweets on the street kind of accounts into their articles. But even then you've got journalistic standards of you need to verify who tweeted that and who, was it true, and is that one person's account, and so on.
Right.
And I think
during the Boston bombing,
absolutely,
I went to the tweets.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing amount of bad information and good information living in the same parallel universe.
And that's where that is a failing of journalism from print to video to television. I mean, not everyone, but it is. Why can't you, there's an immediate emergency need when you talk about the Boston situation, but at some point you just got to be able to slow down and think about what you're reporting.
Well, Eric, the half hour has just gone by rapidly. Thanks for being on the program.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right.
I'll see you next week.
All right.